On a crisp Monday morning, Raymond Sanders stepped into his pristine office on the 17th floor, his gaze sweeping over the historic Boston streets below. The quarterly contract reports lay precisely where they belonged, on his mahogany desk. His morning coffee was at the perfect temperature, and the heavy linen blinds were angled just so, ensuring the autumn sun wouldn't cast a glare on his computer screen. Everything was in its rightful place, functioning with the clockwork regularity Raymond had come to expect and demand over the past 8 months. Margaret Foster had been managing his household and personal office for nearly 3/4 of a year, and in all that time, she hadn't made a single audible mistake or misplaced a single document. Raymond settled into his leather chair, systematically reviewed his unread emails, signed 3 urgent corporate acquisitions, and drank his coffee, never once giving conscious thought to the woman who had prepared it. That was simply how his world operated when things ran smoothly. Efficiency bred a comfortable sort of invisibility, allowing him to navigate his successful life without unnecessary pauses. It was his sister, Florence, who shattered that seamless illusion later that afternoon, arriving unannounced at his Beacon Hill residence. As was her custom whenever she desired his undivided attention, she tossed her designer handbag onto the velvet armchair, crossed her elegant legs, and waited with an air of calculated impatience until Raymond finally lifted his eyes from his smartphone screen. Florence demanded to know if Raymond was truly aware of the erratic schedule his quiet domestic assistant had been keeping lately. She pointed out that while the coffee was ready today, Margaret had left nearly 2 hours early the previous afternoon. "She arrived late on Wednesday morning," Florence added, her voice sharp. "Are you completely oblivious to the shifting patterns under your own roof, or simply too preoccupied with your real estate empire to care?" Raymond placed his phone flat on the polished wooden table, his defense mechanisms automatically engaging. "The young woman consistently completes her work to perfection," he stated calmly. Florence scoffed openly, leaning forward. "She's only efficient when she's physically present," she countered. "Her frequent disappearances are becoming an undeniable liability that a man of your standing should not tolerate." "Don't you find it highly unusual," she looked at him intently, "that a 26-year-old girl from a distant working-class pocket of the city, with no recognizable family ties or verifiable local references, is suddenly requesting early departures without providing a clear explanation?" Raymond maintained his composure. "I feel no professional obligation to interrogate my employees about their private lives outside their contracted working hours." Florence stood up, smoothing her tailored skirt. As the homeowner, she delivered a parting warning. "You possess every right to know exactly what transpires beneath your roof." With that, she walked out the front door. That evening, as Raymond sat alone in his dimly lit study, reviewing financial projections on his monitor, his mind drifted from the spreadsheets and returned to his sister's pointed accusations. Twice before, each time the thought had arisen, he had consciously dismissed it as mere family gossip. Yet, when the memory surfaced a third time, he found himself unable to push the growing curiosity aside. It wasn't that he suddenly harbored deep-seated mistrust toward Margaret, but rather that Florence had introduced a sharp question where absolute certainty had once existed. And questions, Raymond knew, had a way of taking root in a man's mind. On Tuesday afternoon, driven by a subtle restlessness he couldn't entirely justify, Raymond returned to his Beacon Hill apartment several hours earlier than his usual corporate schedule allowed. He found Margaret in the kitchen, meticulously wiping down the marble countertops and organizing the silver utensils with her signature quiet concentration. She offered him a respectful bow of her head upon his sudden entry, gathered her cleaning cloths, and began to make her way down the long, carpeted hallway toward the service exit. Raymond paused at the threshold, calling out her name softly. She stopped mid-step and turned around, her expression one of calm attentiveness. "Do you have any pressing engagements this afternoon?" he inquired, noticing a brief but highly perceptible pause before she answered. "I had planned to step out for a personal matter, if my services are no longer required." When he pressed further, asking for the specific location of her errand, she paused a second time, her voice steady as she replied, "I need to settle a routine administrative matter that is not entirely urgent." Raymond nodded slowly, granting her permission to leave early. He stood silently in the hallway as the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind her departure. The idea of an administrative errand at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon felt hollow, prompting Raymond to grab his car keys from the console table before he could fully rationalize his actions. "I'm just going out for a drive to clear my head after a long day of numbers," he told himself as he descended into the underground parking garage. Yet, when he caught sight of Margaret walking briskly around the corner of the block, her coat wrapped tightly against the New England wind, he turned the steering wheel and followed her at a discreet distance. She walked with the firm, unwavering stride of someone who had memorized every single sidewalk tile along the path, never hesitating at busy street intersections or pausing to check her mobile phone for directions. Raymond maintained a careful 3-car distance, watching through his windshield as the grand, historic brick townhouses of Beacon Hill gradually gave way to the dense, commercial architecture of downtown Boston. The wide, tree-lined avenues began to narrow significantly, and the well-manicured green spaces disappeared entirely, replaced by the bustling concrete entryways of the public transit system. Margaret walked directly down the stone stairs of the Government Center subway station, vanishing into the underground crowds before Raymond could find a legal place to park his vehicle. He was forced to idle his car in a double-lane zone, staring blankly at the dark subway entrance, his hands gripped tightly around the leather steering wheel as the engine hummed softly. Realizing he couldn't follow her beneath the city streets without exposing his surveillance, he drove around the block 3 times before finally giving up and returning to his empty apartment. He slept poorly that night, not because he suspected her of any specific wrongdoing, but because his orderly world had suddenly developed an inexplicable blind spot that defied his need for complete control. The vivid image of Margaret descending into the crowded subway station with absolute tranquility remained burned into his thoughts, suggesting a hidden destination that had absolutely nothing to do with his luxury residence. Raymond was a man accustomed to knowing every variable within his personal orbit, possessing comprehensive data streams for his real estate contracts, his corporate partners, and his office subordinates. Margaret Foster represented the singular, unmapped territory in his otherwise predictable life, and the sudden realization of his own ignorance troubled him deeply as the midnight hours ticked away. On Wednesday morning, she arrived precisely at 7, prepared his breakfast without uttering a single unnecessary word, and retreated into the depths of the household with the silent efficiency he had always praised. He found himself studying her movements from afar, wondering if that professional quietness was a shield designed to protect a secret far more complex than a simple administrative errand. Florence called his office on Wednesday afternoon, her voice filled with the triumphant expectation of someone who believed her initial suspicions were about to be validated by an expensive investigation. "Have you confronted the girl yet?" she demanded. "I merely asked about her afternoon destination and received a satisfactory answer regarding a personal errand," he replied flatly. Florence sighed loudly through the line. "You are being incredibly naive to accept such a vague explanation from a domestic servant who treats your home like a transit station." Raymond defended his stance. "I possess no logical reason to doubt her honesty." But his sister cut him off. "Patterns of secrecy must be taken seriously before they cause irreparable damage." After ending the call, he stared at his phone screen for several minutes, realizing that Thursday was approaching, the specific day when Margaret historically requested to leave the apartment ahead of schedule. This time, he decided, would be different. He would not allow himself to be left stranded on the sidewalk while she vanished into the underground veins of the city. Thursday morning arrived under a heavy blanket of gray clouds, prompting Raymond to strategically reschedule 2 major afternoon board meetings, ensuring his own calendar was entirely clear by 3 o'clock. He informed his longtime business partner, Gerald, that he had an urgent personal matter to attend to in the city, an explanation Gerald accepted without a single prying question. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Margaret knocked softly on the door of his private study, asking if it would be terribly inconvenient for her to depart at 4 o'clock to attend to her recurring obligations. Raymond agreed without hesitation, watching her nod with a small, grateful smile before she quietly closed the door to let him finish his paperwork. He waited exactly 10 minutes after her departure before heading down to the garage, starting his sedan, and parking it half a block away from the main building entrance with the engine turned off. At 5 minutes past 4, Margaret emerged from the lobby doors, carrying a heavy canvas tote bag that Raymond had never seen her bring into his home during her morning arrivals. Instead of walking toward the downtown subway station, as she had done on Tuesday, she turned eastward, navigating through a series of older, industrial streets that Raymond hadn't driven through in several years. The afternoon traffic was thick, forcing him to stop at 2 consecutive red lights and nearly causing him to lose sight of her slender figure as she crossed a busy commercial intersection. He accelerated carefully, turning the corner just in time to see her walk toward a weathered, historic multi-family wood frame house with faded yellow paint and a chipped green metal gate. The small front yard was crowded with mismatched ceramic pots containing hardy green plants that someone had clearly tended to with great effort, but very little financial means. Raymond parked his car across the street, watching intently as Margaret stepped up to the entrance and knocked twice on the green metal surface with her bare knuckles. A moment later, the door was pulled open from the inside and she stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the heavy green gate clicking shut behind her as the quiet residential street returned to its ordinary afternoon rhythm. Raymond turned off his ignition, leaning back against his headrest while his eyes remained fixed on the faded yellow facade of the old multi-family house across the asphalt. Outside on the sidewalk, a young boy was repeatedly kicking a red rubber ball against a brick wall. An older woman was diligently sweeping her porch, and a stray dog slept peacefully beneath the shadow of an elm tree. The neighborhood presented an unremarkable facade, yet a disquieting tension settled in Raymond's chest, a feeling logic couldn't quite dislodge. For over 20 minutes, he remained cocooned in the hushed stillness of his car, his gaze fixed on the emerald door, but Margaret failed to reappear in the afternoon's cool embrace. Finally, he started the engine and turned back towards Beacon Hill, his mind now a labyrinth of questions far more intricate than when he'd left his office, shadowed by the certainty of his return the following day. Arriving back at the faded yellow house on Friday, Raymond consciously avoided framing his presence as surveillance. Instead, he rationalized it as a professional imperative, a necessary step to verify an operational anomaly. He told himself he was merely managing a potential risk, a responsible employer. Yet the stark realization that he had arrived before Margaret had even rounded the corner rendered that corporate veneer utterly transparent. She appeared precisely at 4:10, the same canvas tote slung over her shoulder, her gait a steady, unhurried rhythm that spoke of a destination of profound personal significance. She rapped twice on the green gate, her patience unwavering until the lock yielded from within. Her slender form cast a fleeting silhouette against the weathered wood before she vanished inside. This time, Raymond stepped out of his vehicle, acknowledging that lurking in a car, staring at a closed door, was a cowardly pursuit of the truth that was beginning to consume him. He moved silently across the asphalt, his leather shoes making no sound on the pavement. As he neared the side entrance of the multi-unit dwelling, a grated window positioned just above eye level, he stood with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, straining to catch the low hum of voices drifting through the metal bars from the apartment within. Margaret's voice was instantly recognizable, stripped of the clipped formality she employed in his presence, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth that was entirely unfamiliar. A second voice joined hers, a man's, thin and raspy with age, speaking with a slow, deliberate cadence that suggested each word exacted a physical toll on his frail body. Raymond remained frozen on the sidewalk, suddenly struck by the sheer absurdity of his predicament. A prominent real estate magnate, overseeing hundreds of employees, was lurking in a narrow alley, attempting to eavesdrop on his housekeeper. He was about to retreat, overcome by a surge of self-reproach, when the clarity of their exchange sharpened, anchoring him to the cold stone foundation of the old house. He heard Margaret gently informing the elderly man that she'd brought a fresh container of chicken soup, assuring him it was still warm, having wrapped it securely before leaving her morning shift. The old man, whom she addressed as Edward, rasped that she shouldn't be squandering her hard-earned money on such indulgences. Margaret's reply was firm. Caring for him was never a burden. She inquired about his joint pain, and Edward dismissed it with a weary sigh, stating he'd simply grown accustomed to the persistent ache over the years. Margaret's tone grew more insistent as she urged him not to accept the pain, promising to bring the new prescription his doctor had ordered on her next visit. A third voice, a woman's, fragile and trembling with a faint tremor that suggested recent tears, joined the hushed conversation. She called Margaret by name, her voice cracking as she confessed that without her constant presence and support, she and Edward would be utterly adrift in their final years. Raymond felt his breath hitch. The elaborate theories his sister had woven over the past 2 weeks dissolved into the autumn air. There was no illicit affair, no clandestine financial scheme, no betrayal within the confines of this modest East Boston dwelling. There was simply a young woman, possessing little of her own, kneeling in a humble room, tending to 2 elderly souls who had no one else left in the world. Raymond retreated from the grated window before Margaret concluded her ministrations, returning to his car and navigating the city's arteries with a profound sense of internal discord. He recalled Florence's sharp, accusatory remarks and marveled at how easily he had allowed those toxic doubts to fester, a consequence of his own demand for absolute transparency. He realized, with a flush of discomfort, that Margaret had never once faltered in her professional duties, never requested an advance, never brought her personal life into his immaculate home. She had simply asked for a few hours of her time, a request he had granted with a chilling indifference, while she spent those hours breathing life back into 2 forgotten souls. He chose not to contact his sister that evening, leaving her latest texts unanswered on his desk, unwilling to let her transform this quiet act of devotion into ammunition for her cynical narratives. The weekend was spent in his study, attempting to immerse himself in the structural blueprints for a new downtown complex. Yet, the lines on the paper continuously blurred, morphing into the image of the weathered green gate. On Monday morning, he sat at his dining table as Margaret served his breakfast, his gaze lingering on the faint, scrubbed calluses on her fingers, testament to manual labor performed long after her official duties concluded. He cleared his throat, breaking the comfortable silence, and inquired if she had resided in the Boston area her entire life. Her answer was simple. She had grown up in the surrounding neighborhoods. When he asked if she maintained close ties with her old neighbors, she paused briefly, before replying that she visited a few long-term acquaintances when her schedule allowed. Raymond studied her face, realizing her responses were meticulously crafted to protect the dignity of the elderly couple from the prying curiosity of a wealthy employer who had previously shown no interest. On Tuesday afternoon, Gerald, during a critical meeting concerning material costs, noticed his partner's uncharacteristic distraction. "Is something troubling you at home, Raymond?" he inquired. Raymond brushed off the question with a vague comment about residential upkeep, but Gerald advised him to address whatever weighed on his mind before it began to derail their corporate endeavors. The advice was sound, yet Raymond knew the question occupying his thoughts could not be resolved through standard business negotiation or a simple strategic adjustment. On Thursday afternoon, he found himself once again driving towards East Boston, parking his sedan in its familiar spot between 2 rusted vehicles belonging to the block's permanent residents. He watched Margaret arrive at 4 o'clock. Before she reached the green gate, however, she paused to scan the street, her eyes lingering on his car for a long, agonizing second before she turned inside. Raymond exhaled slowly, wondering if she had recognized his vehicle or if the constant vulnerability of her situation had simply heightened her awareness of her surroundings. He waited nearly an hour this time, observing the neighborhood's ordinary rhythm until the green gate creaked open, revealing a thin, elderly man in a faded flannel shirt. Edward stepped onto the porch, squinting against the late afternoon sun, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his right leg dragging with a pronounced, painful limp. A moment later, Margaret appeared in the doorway behind him, her eyes scanning the street until they met Raymond's parked car with a quiet, undeniable clarity. Raymond felt a sudden jolt of shame. She knew precisely who was watching her, and his continued presence in the neighborhood was no longer a discreet verification, but a profound intrusion into her sanctuary. The following Friday morning, Raymond departed early for a site inspection in the southern suburbs, leaving explicit instructions for Margaret to deep clean the historical guest suite, which remained permanently closed. He believed this extensive task would occupy her in a quiet corner of the apartment for the entire morning, far from the main entrance and the intercom. He hadn't anticipated Florence utilizing her emergency spare key to enter the residence at 10:30, driven by her relentless desire to uncover what she perceived as a grand deception. Florence strode into the grand hallway, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors, until she encountered Margaret, emerging from the guest suite with a dusting cloth in hand. Florence immediately demanded an espresso, following the younger woman into the kitchen and settling onto a high leather stool to initiate an unprovoked interrogation. She questioned Margaret about her employment history prior to arriving at Beacon Hill, leaning forward with a sharp gaze, insinuating that the sudden closure of her previous workplace in the suburbs sounded remarkably convenient. Margaret maintained her composure, explaining calmly that her former employer had relocated permanently to another state, leaving the property vacant and forcing her to seek new opportunities in the city center. Florence shifted her focus to the East Boston neighborhood, stating bluntly that Raymond had mentioned her frequent visits to the area, and demanding to know the exact identities of the individuals she was supporting. Margaret stood by the sink, her hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform, explaining that she was simply assisting two elderly individuals who had been instrumental in her own childhood. Florence scoffed, asking if it wasn't incredibly irresponsible to funnel her modest salary into the hands of strangers while benefiting from the shelter and security Raymond provided. The older woman continued her verbal assault, suggesting that financial desperation often drove people in Margaret's position to make regrettable decisions concerning their employer's personal property. The implication of theft hung heavy in the warm kitchen air, transforming the quiet space into a courtroom where poverty was presumed guilt. Margaret looked directly into Florence's eyes, her voice devoid of fear or anger, inviting the wealthy woman to thoroughly inspect her private living quarters immediately. She stated with icy dignity that in 8 months of service, she had not touched a single item that did not belong to her. For her upbringing had taught her that self-respect was far more valuable than silver. Florence stood, visibly unsettled by the young woman's complete lack of defensiveness, and gathered her coat, muttering that she would discuss the irregular living arrangements with her brother. When Raymond returned to the apartment at 2 p.m, he found Margaret meticulously polishing the brass door handles of the guest room. Her movements carried a rigid formality, betraying an internal storm. He entered the room, praising the quality of her work, but noticed she refused to meet his gaze as she gathered her cleaning supplies into her plastic caddy. He asked directly if his sister had visited the apartment during his absence. Margaret paused, confirming Florence had arrived mid-morning and had posed several detailed questions regarding her financial choices. Raymond felt a heavy wave of anger wash over him, realizing his sister had crossed a boundary he had failed to protect through his own hesitation and silence. He offered his deepest apologies for his family's behavior, assuring her that he had never authorized such an intrusive confrontation under his roof. Margaret placed her polishing cloth into the caddy, taking a slow, grounding breath before she asked Raymond if he had also harbored the same degrading suspicions about her integrity when he first began following her. Raymond refused to hide behind a convenient lie, admitting openly that while he never believed she was a thief, he had allowed his sister's questions to cloud his judgment out of a foolish need to know everything. He confessed that he had stood outside the grated window in East Boston the previous week and heard her feeding the elderly man, realizing in that singular moment how incredibly small his own perspective had been. Margaret sat down on the edge of the velvet armchair. The long-standing wall of professional distance between employer and employee finally collapsing under the weight of shared honesty. She looked out the window at the distant city skyline, her voice dropping to a soft whisper as she confessed that Edward and Pearl Vance were the two human beings who had saved her life when she had absolutely nothing left. She explained that her mother had passed away from a sudden heart ailment when Margaret was only 15 years old, leaving her 5 children to navigate the harsh realities of the city without financial protection. Her older siblings had quickly scattered to different corners of the country to survive, leaving her entirely alone in their old neighborhood with no legal guardian and no visible means of support. She spent 2 exhausting weeks sleeping on a concrete floor in a neighbor's crowded apartment until the family could no longer afford to feed an extra mouth, forcing her onto the streets with a single backpack of clothes. In a moment of absolute desperation, she had knocked on the door of Edward's small automotive repair shop, offering to clean the garage and organize his tools in exchange for a safe corner to sleep. Edward and his wife Pearl did not possess a spare bedroom, but they spent 2 hours clearing out an old wooden tool shed in the back of their small yard, lining it with blankets and a small electric heater to give her a home. Raymond stood entirely motionless by the window, listening to the brutal reality of a life shaped by systemic neglect and profound personal grace. Realization dawning on him that his own wealth was merely an accident of birth. Margaret explained that her early departures on Thursdays were entirely due to Edward's severe flare-ups, which prevented him from lifting a spoon or standing up without assistance, leaving Pearl too frail to manage his care alone. She confessed she had hidden the truth because previous employers had terminated her services the moment they discovered she had significant caretaking responsibilities outside her domestic duties. Raymond assured her with a quiet ferocity that her position in his home was absolutely secure. Realizing that the young woman sitting before him possessed a wealth of character that could never be bought with a real estate empire. On Thursday afternoon, Raymond placed a call to his sister, his voice carrying a cold, uncompromising finality that Florence had never encountered from her younger brother during their entire adult lives. He informed her that he was fully aware of her cruel behavior in his kitchen and demanded the immediate return of his emergency residence key before the end of the business week. Florence attempted to defend her actions by claiming she was merely protecting his financial interests, but Raymond cut her off, stating that Margaret Foster was a guest of honor in his home and that her dignity was no longer open for discussion. He instructed her to leave the spare key with the front desk concierge and ended the conversation before she could offer another manipulative excuse, permanently closing that chapter of toxic family interference. The following Friday morning, Raymond instructed Margaret to remain at home until the afternoon, explaining that he had arranged a private transportation service to bring Edward and Pearl to a specialized medical facility in the city. Raymond drove to East Boston alone, parking his sedan in front of the faded yellow house and walking up the wooden steps to knock firmly on the weathered green gate. Pearl opened the door, her small frame wrapped in a faded wool shawl as she studied his simple attire with a mixture of caution and quiet curiosity. Raymond introduced himself respectfully, explaining that he had come to escort them to their scheduled appointments and that Margaret had been granted the morning off to rest after an exhausting week. He was invited into the modest apartment, which was filled with the rich aroma of chicory coffee and the spotless, disciplined cleanliness that Margaret had clearly brought from her childhood years in the house. Edward sat in a worn leather armchair by the window, his large, arthritic hands resting heavily on his lap as he evaluated the wealthy real estate mogul with the sharp, discerning gaze of a craftsman who had spent a lifetime reading the true quality of raw materials. Raymond sat on a wooden stool across from the old mechanic, accepting a chipped porcelain mug of black coffee from Pearl without a single hesitation or display of affluent discomfort. They spent nearly an hour discussing the changing landscape of the city, with Edward offering sharp, insightful critiques of modern architectural practices that valued quick corporate profits over enduring human craftsmanship. Raymond listened with deep respect, realizing that the old man possessed a profound wisdom born of practical labor and survival, a perspective that no elite business school could ever replicate. Before leaving for the clinic, Raymond quietly placed a folded piece of stationery on the small kitchen table, instructing Pearl to open it only after they had returned from their medical evaluations later that afternoon. The note contained 3 distinct pieces of information that Raymond had systematically arranged through his corporate network over the past 72 hours to permanently alter the trajectory of their fragile lives. The first line indicated that a permanent commercial account had been established at the local pharmacy under their names, with all past and future medication expenses fully covered by his corporate estate. The second line confirmed that a dedicated non-emergency medical vehicle had been retained to transport them to weekly physical therapy sessions to help Edward regain the functional use of his right hand. The third and most significant line stated that the building's landlord had received a lump sum rental payment covering the next 5 years of their tenancy, ensuring that the threat of eviction would never darken their doorstep again. 3 months later, the faded yellow house in East Boston featured a beautifully crafted solid oak front door that opened smoothly without the loud metallic screech that had characterized the old green gate for decades. The new entrance had been meticulously installed on a crisp Saturday morning by a local carpenter named Charles, whom Raymond had hired from one of his commercial construction sites. Edward had spent the entire morning sitting on the porch in his new fleece jacket, offering colorful advice regarding the proper alignment of the steel hinges while Charles worked with a respectful grin. Raymond stood in the small front yard holding a fresh mug of Pearl's coffee while watching the neighborhood children play a lively game of street hockey on the asphalt across the street. The weekly Friday morning visits to the old multifamily home had become a foundational anchor in Raymond's otherwise frantic corporate schedule, providing a quiet space where numbers and profit margins held absolutely no value. Through the targeted physical therapy sessions that Raymond had funded, Edward had regained enough structural mobility in his right hand to securely grip his coffee mug and turn the pages of his newspaper without assistance. Pearl's chronic nocturnal cough had completely subsided due to the regular use of the advanced inhalers prescribed by the private geriatric specialist, allowing the elderly couple to experience their first peaceful winter in over a decade. On a warm afternoon in late November, Raymond arrived at the house to find a small wooden dining table set with a new plaid tablecloth and a large steaming pot of traditional New England beef stew. Pearl emerged from the kitchen with a bright smile that completely erased the deep lines of exhaustion that had once dominated her face, commanding him to sit down before the food grew cold. Margaret emerged from the back room, her hair tied back in a simple ribbon, as she shared a knowing, humorous look with Raymond over the elderly couple's sudden, unannounced hospitality. They sat together around the modest table, a wealthy developer, a quiet domestic assistant, and two resilient elders, sharing a rich meal that felt far more luxurious than any corporate dinner Raymond had ever attended in the grand ballrooms of Beacon Hill. After the meal, as the women washed the dishes in the kitchen, Edward looked out the new oak door, his voice low and serious as he observed that Raymond looked remarkably different than the tense, distracted man who had first arrived on his porch. Raymond confessed that building homes for other people had occupied his entire life, but that he had foolishly forgotten to construct a meaningful life for himself until he witnessed the profound love residing within this small apartment. Later that evening, Raymond and Margaret drove back to the Beacon Hill neighborhood together in the quiet luxury of his sedan. The bright holiday lights of the city reflecting softly across the windshield as they navigated the heavy highway traffic. As they approached the residential tower, Raymond slowed the vehicle, clearing his throat gently before asking Margaret if she would be willing to join him for a casual coffee at a small neighborhood cafe the following Saturday afternoon. He assured her with complete sincerity that regardless of her response, her professional position, and the support for Edward and Pearl would remain entirely unchanged, as he valued her presence as a human being above all else. Margaret turned her head, her beautiful face illuminated by the passing street lamps as a genuine, radiant smile finally broke across her lips, her soft voice confirming that she had been waiting for him to ask that exact question for a very long time. As the deep winter snows begin to blanket the historic avenues of the city, coating the brick facades and the modest wooden porches alike in a uniform layer of quiet white, the profound transformation that occurred within the hearts of these individuals offers a timeless testament to the hidden currents of human grace. For the older generations who have spent a lifetime navigating the unpredictable tides of struggle, loss, and endurance, this story serves as a beautiful reminder that our true value as human beings is never measured by the material empires we construct or the sterile perfections we maintain, but by our willingness to look beyond our own blind spots and acknowledge the silent sacrifices of those around us. Wealth, in its most common worldly definition, often acts as a heavy insulation that dulls our spiritual senses, creating a false illusion of self-sufficiency that convinces us we are entirely separate from the hardships of the vulnerable souls who sweep our floors and prepare our daily bread. Yet, as the years advance and the physical strength of youth inevitably fades into the gentle twilight of old age, the grand architectures of corporate success begin to look remarkably hollow when compared to the simple, enduring beauty of an unconditional act of devotion. The profound lesson woven into the fabric of Raymond's awakening is that true sight requires a deliberate softening of the ego, a conscious decision to step outside our comfort zones and stand in the narrow, unfamiliar alleyways of human suffering without a corporate agenda or a desire for personal praise. Margaret Foster, devoid of social standing or financial comfort, harbored a kingdom of character within her delicate frame. She was living proof that the noblest form of charity isn't a distant, tax-deductible check, but rather the heartfelt offering of one's time, presence, and a steaming bowl of soup to those overlooked by a world in perpetual motion. Her unwavering devotion to Edward and Pearl Vance serves as a poignant reminder that the heart's debts cannot be settled with mere coin of the realm. These are sacred vows, best honored through steadfast companionship, shared mirth, and the comforting touch of a hand when shadows loom. For the soul that has journeyed through many years, it becomes glaringly evident that the countless, seemingly forgotten acts of kindness are the very stones that build a fortress, capable of standing firm against life's final chill. They leave an indelible mark, a legacy forever woven into the fabric of the lives we have touched. In the grand tapestry of existence, we come to realize that every closed door, every weathered exterior, and every soul we encounter on our fleeting earthly passage is an open invitation to extend compassion. It is a gentle whisper, reminding us that when we finally muster the courage to truly see and to step beyond the apathy that so easily engulfs us, we are not just offering solace to others, but are, in essence, finding our own eternal sanctuary within.